Hi, I'm Rod Pry, the director of the Pennsylvania State Sunday School Association, and this is our weekly International Sunday School Lesson Preview. This is the preview of the lesson for Sunday, May the 30th. This is the final lesson in the spring quarter of lessons based on the overall theme, Prophets Faithful to God's Covenant. Over the past 3 months, we've been studying a number of the Old Testament prophets who were faithful to God's covenant and their messages. We've seen messages that warned of God's wrath and judgment, God's promise of deliverance and renewal, and the promise of the coming of the ultimate source of forgiveness in the form of Jesus Christ, the Messiah. As we conclude this current series of lessons today, we will turn to the Old Testament book of Jonah and a lesson entitled Preaching to Enemies. Just about everyone knows the story of Jonah, but I'm afraid that we often get hung up on the first part of the story, Jonah trying to run away from God and how he ends up in the belly of a great fish or whale. Yes, that's interesting, and there is a powerful message there about the consequences of not listening to God. But there is much more to the story, and that's what today's lesson focuses on. The first 2 chapters of the book of Jonah tell about God's call and Jonah's attempt to avoid what God wanted him to do. In fact, the very first verse in the first chapter of the book tells us that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, telling him to get up, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because their evil has come before me. The first question that I see here is, why was God calling Jonah to go to Nineveh? We don't know much about Jonah, but obviously he was a very effective and powerful preacher, as you see later in the book. And he was the right man for the job, and he was the one that God was calling. But verse 3 in chapter 1 goes on to say that Jonah got up to flee to Tarshish from the Lord's presence. Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, but why? This is part of the story that we may not fully understand. Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, and he really did have good reasons. First of all, where was Nineveh? It was the largest city in Assyria. It was where the Assyrian king resided, and the Jews and the Assyrians were enemies. As far as Jonah was probably concerned, it would have been better for God to destroy the whole city, all the people, all the troops, and the king. Going to Nineveh to save the city might look like he was actually aiding the enemy. But he probably also had a personal reason for not wanting to go to Nineveh. It was a very evil and dangerous place, known for the atrocities that took place there. And Jonah probably feared for his own life. A Jew going to an Assyrian city? That could be very dangerous. He could be killed. So Jonah had his reasons for not wanting to go to Nineveh. But you know the story. Jonah tried to flee from God, but he was swallowed up by a great fish, and there in the belly of a whale he repented. Back on dry ground, verses 1 and 2 of today's lesson in chapter 3 tell us, "Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh and proclaim to it the message I give you." This time, Jonah obeyed. Notice that God gave Jonah a second chance. And isn't it comforting to know that God often gives us second chances to do His will as well? But what was the prophecy that Jonah was to deliver to Nineveh? Verse 5 tells us, in 40 days, Nineveh will be demolished. And as I said earlier, Jonah must have been a very powerful preacher because the people of the city believed his message. Even the king believed and sent out a proclamation in verses 7 through 9. Do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink, but let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows, God may even relent and with compassion turn from His fierce anger so that we will not perish. And when God saw that they repented and how they turned from their evil ways, verse 10 says that he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. That's where today's lesson scripture ends. But you might want to study the fourth and final chapter of the book of Jonah as well. Jonah was successful. His message was heard and received. The people repented, and the city was saved from destruction. Jonah should have been thrilled, but was he? No. The first verse in chapter 4 says that Jonah was greatly displeased and became furious. Why? Remember what I said earlier, he probably wanted to see the city destroyed. The title of today's lesson is Preaching to Enemies. To Jonah, the people of Nineveh were enemies and should have been destroyed. They were evil. But how did God see those same people? He saw them with love. He saw them as being lost and in need of His grace and forgiveness. Later, during Jesus' ministry, the religious leaders of His day often accused Him of associating with sinners. And what did Jesus say? He said, "Those who are well don't need a doctor, but who does? The sick." In other words, sinners are the ones who need forgiveness. And God, in His great love, wants all persons, even our enemies, to come to Him and receive the salvation that He freely offers. Thank you for being with me today. I'm Rod Pry for the Pennsylvania State Sunday School Association, and I hope you'll be with me again next week as we begin a brand new quarter of lessons from the New Testament with the title Confident Hope, and a unit for June entitled Jesus Teaches About Faith.